What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Ron Ton, and we speak about facilitation as a skill in diplomatic negotiation. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand, take your own notes. Scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. Now, lean back to be inspired. Hello, Ron. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and I was just saying that it's been more than 3 years that I haven't recorded a podcast with seeing and being in the same room with my guest.
Here we go, back in the physical world.
Yes, and we met in a plane. And had such an interesting conversation. I was intrigued by the work you're doing.
Yeah.
And cannot wait to share it with the audience.
Yeah.
And before we're getting there, let me always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Yeah. Well, that's an intriguing question because I didn't. Although I realize my work is mainly in the business of negotiating and mediation. But I do realize I call myself a trainer, an educator, trying also to, through training, to make people better. But I do realize that a big part of what I'm doing is also facilitation during the training. Let me give you an example. For example, in negotiating training, I train a lot on strategic concept. That is more like, it's not really knowledge transfer, but it's very serious business where you also have to share some theories. But then immediately you apply it on a simulation game or you have a case study and then you are 100% a facilitator. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I knew, and I should call myself part of that, a facilitator. But because of your invitation, I found out that facilitation is really a big word with a lot of things behind it.
It is. And I think well, in Dutch, there is a specific name, facilitator.
Yeah.
In German, for instance, they would translate facilitator as a moderator.
Uh-huh.
That for me is not the same thing at all. So it creates a lot of confusion as well.
Yeah. No, that's the same. You see that I like also to work with definitions, that I'm also training mediators how to mediate better in negotiating. Mm-hmm. But a mediator is not a negotiator. Huh? So you need to be clear on what it is and what is not. And but when you type in a definition of facilitation, it's unbelievable. It goes all sides of the world, basically. I mean, all sides of definitions. And it has a kind of thing in it as also, supporting people, facilitate, mm-hmm. to help people, you know?
To make it easy.
But if you look to the profession of a facilitator, then it's really somebody who leads a debate, who's a good communicator and who need to engage people. And then it becomes more a kind of professional job. Yeah? But if you really look at it, it's unbelievable. There must be 100,000 of definitions of it.
Yeah. And since you mentioned negotiation and mediation, and you work in diplomacy, so you're basically training diplomats to become better negotiators and mediators. So to what extent is facilitation actually a skill that you actively teach and that is important in these roles?
Yeah, as I already indicated, is that I never saw it that I was facilitating or training on facilitation. But of course, if you are working, for example, on training on negotiating skills, you also talk about how do you manage a negotiating team. Yeah? So to let people realize that, basically, you are not saying them what to do, but you facilitate that they think about it themselves. That's the best way to learn, And then it's also facilitation. So basically, when I'm thinking about it, indeed, you have all those words. In my world, it is mainly then negotiation, mediation, but mediation is more closer to facilitation. Now, although, no, now I think about it, it's not, but like in my world also, when I work with groups getting out of conflict, there is also a technique more focused on leading a dialogue, dialogue facilitation. And that's what I have in my mind. So facilitate in combination with the word dialogue. And that is, of course, different than negotiating and mediation, but very essential, for example, as a kind of pre-talk, before you engage them into negotiating or before you are equipped as a mediator to work on mediating a negotiating process. So if you talk about facilitation as a diplomatic skill, I think we should see it intertwined with other diplomatic skills, part of communication, part of mediation and negotiating.
Yeah. And so when I think of the difference between facilitation, mediation, and negotiation, I would think that in negotiation, both parties have a very specific goal and try to implement or to get as close to their own goal as possible. In mediation, you have two opposite parties with different opinions, and you hope to find a common understanding. And maybe in facilitation, you have the outcome is not clear. So there are not clear position of who wants what, but it's the group that collaborates together to create something that wasn't there before.
Yeah, well, in that sense, facilitation can be less procedural, can be less organized, so to speak, in the sense that you have a freer space to express yourself. But negotiating, there's a huge difference between negotiating and mediation in the sense that in negotiating, parties are defending an interest. And in defending the interest, they want to get most of what they want. So if you're lucky, they collaborate. If you're not lucky, they fight. Mediating is not defending an interest, as part of something you want or a conflict, but a mediator is actually a facilitator of the negotiating process. So that means that a mediator, of course, a mediator has an interest, but not an interest as an agenda on the table. The interest of a mediator is very simply to be seen as a respected and good mediator. And so in mediation, my proposition is often that if you would like to be a good mediator, then you must be smarter in negotiating skills than the parties you are mediating. You must have a kind of overkill on experience and knowledge that when you are mediating, of course, parties look to you, that you're completely neutral, that you do not take a stand, that what you say to the one, you say to the other. But basically, you are an expert on negotiation, but you're not a negotiator yourself. Because if you negotiate as a mediator, you're out. You're not seen as a neutral mediator. And then in facilitation, I see a resemblance in my world for diplomatic skills and diplomatic training, that a facilitation, it's not like arbitration, where you have a legal set of rules behind you. Maybe it's something like conciliation, but conciliation is more that you have agreed on a certain framework within you talk with each other, not legally, but in a kind of set of written and unwritten rules. So facilitation could be, for example, what I see is that you always have in very complex negotiating. I do a lot of business as well in assisting parties getting out of conflict, going to a peace negotiating, that you could maybe see facilitation as a form unattached still to giving in or still to agree on a procedure, but that you have a talk. Mm-hmm. For example, a simple talk before you start. How do we organize negotiating? Mm-hmm. And that can be in a kind of pre-talk facilitated way. The only point is actually facilitation suggests there is a facilitator. And then a facilitator is not an official mediator, but there are also negotiating processes possible that the negotiating parties themselves organize that pre-talk. So the complexity about this is actually when you talk about facilitation, it suggests a facilitator who is a kind of third party.
And who is hopefully neutral.
Yeah, of course. But then the point is with a mediator is also a third party and is actually officially agreed by both parties that there should be a mediator. So I'm afraid that parties will not have this insight that there is a slight different connotation, that a facilitator, what is it different to a dialogue manager or to a mediator. But again, to me, mediator is more formal, is more agreeable and embedded in procedures. And facilitation to me, in this sense, of bringing parties to a negotiating table, is more a kind of, let's talk and let's have a professional. Let's have a professional who can structure a way of talking with each other. And then it can easily step in.
To basically design the conversation that is happening.
Yeah.
And that might even then avoid a mediation because both parties understand what the other
ones. As a step up to an official mediated process. And in rare cases, parties talk with each other without a mediator. That is also possible, of course. So you could see it that way. But, facilitation, it everywhere, but also in the diplomatic world, it could be a lot of different things.
Yes. And I usually think of facilitation even as a kind of leadership skill, because facilitation means listening, means being present, means asking to understand or asking to understand another perspective instead of just asking for information.
Yeah. No, I fully agree on that. It is a very powerful tool and skill. It belongs in the toolbox of leadership. I should say easier leadership than management, But again, it has also to do, what does a leader have to do? Leading, but not in the sense of a top-down hierarchical process.
Not a dictator leader.
Exactly. That is devastating. Then nothing will work. So in that sense, if you use facilitation technique to be a motivator and to make sure that the team works well, then it's a very powerful technique. And sometimes maybe, that facilitation can maybe seen also as a too fake thing. By that, I mean, if you talk about leading a meeting, or chairing a meeting, or being a secretary of the meeting, or making notes, then you have an official role. So facilitating can be more and less strict. But basically, if you talk about part of leadership, it's all part and parcel of the same. It's basically that good leaders, they have an eye for what actually kind of empathy, how you can even assist the people to perform better. And if they perform better, you perform better. So simply as that.
Exactly. And I think especially when you're in the leadership position and you're hosting a meeting, you're inviting people to spend time with you around the table, then yes, you have to facilitate this meeting in one way or another. Because just hoping that people will show up and contribute and take a decision, I think it's almost naive.
But this is just that normally, especially also in the diplomatic world, and if it's more officially, like, for example, in a working group, in an international organization, or bilaterally between two countries, we just call it chairing a meeting. But a chairperson is more procedural. It is more structured and organized. But basically, if you chair a meeting and you probably are too dominant, then you get the same effect as if a facilitator is too dominant and you block communication.
Yeah, and the key of a facilitator is, and that's why I would love to come back to the concept of neutrality. Because a facilitator is, well, we have a lot of debates or discussions. Can a human being be actually neutral? But a facilitator, I would say, is at least neutral when it comes to the outcome. So is not attached to a certain outcome. And hence, it's not about the facilitator taking space, but the facilitator's role to make sure that everyone gets to speak. So if I understand you correctly, the chairperson of a meeting is usually the person who is attached to the outcome or who has an interest in the outcome of the meeting and hence cannot be neutral.
That depends on the situation. Like, for example, well, if I now totally formal, like if you are chairing a working group or a so-called ambassadors meeting, then you are of one of the member states. And by coincidence at that time, or you have a fixed president, or you are just in a rotation, you are the president. So then you are on one hand representing a country who also have interest at stakes, even in the bigger picture of European policy. But we do know that if you, as a chairperson, and you would like to make a deal with 27 parties, if you maximize your national interest too much, you block the rest. And if you are a chair, often you are seen as a kind of president and of, what happens in Brussels or in New York. You also would like to be seen that you can make progress and that you can bring policies forward. And that means basically that you it's always a dilemma. It's a paradox, because in this way, you as a chairperson, call it a facilitator of a meeting, you have a national interest, but also collective interest. And if you maximize too much on your national interest, probably you don't get a decision. If you maximize too much on the collective interest,
you lose the votes back home.
You can lose your job, Yeah. So there is always, it's very interesting in that sense, also psychologically speaking, there is a kind of struggle going on in the mind of the ones who's then chairing, where to find the proper balance. And so in that sense, it's the same. Okay, but this is quite formal chairing. It could easily mean that I'm now doing a lot of, and this is super interesting, work more what we call on the local level. There's a kind of trend going on, also talking about what is effective, in the sense of being a donor. Well, you can give your money, let's say, to national organizations or globalized international organizations, but we all realize that it starts at the local level, in conflict prevention or in solving issues and disputes and getting to economic growth. So I'm also doing quite a lot of work with insider mediators who work within local communities. And then it could easily be that because you are seen as a very respected leader, let's say a traditional leader, sometimes even a religious leader or leader of a women's group or a youth group, then you are a kind of chair of, I call it indeed facilitator, still having an interest out, but not in the sense like a formalized one with all kinds of rules. And then the third actually is basically that you are totally unattached to any party or any interest. But to be honest, if I now look back on it, if I transfer it to the way conflict parties, for example, but I also see it, by the way, in the humanitarian world, where humanitarian organizations have to negotiate very difficult access to occupied territories. So they negotiate often with non-state armed groups, In that kind of negotiating, it's more that they talk about a third party as a mediator. Mm-hmm. And then the question is it a respected leader? Is it an agreeable former president of the country or whatever? Or is it somebody maybe from the civil society, not so attached to state interest? Yeah. So there's a huge variety of a pool where they draw on, but the bottom line is the parties must agree on that person.
Yeah. It's interesting because an entire new world opens to me. And if I understand it correctly, is when there is an official meeting for political parties of diplomats, it's usually either they just self-organize, in air quotes, so they have a conversation with the chairperson, and this person is like the manager of a team in an organization. They do have some particular interest, but they also want to listen to the others if they have something to say. Or there is a problem or something at stake, and then there is an official role of a mediator or a negotiator. And I wonder whether it's not a missed opportunity to actually have someone who is neutral to make sure that everyone gets to say something in a meeting. Because it would also take so much burden off the shoulders of the chairperson, because everyone complains about too many emails and not enough time. And I cannot imagine that the leaders in our world have more time to read their emails than a normal person does. So to prepare a meeting, to chair it, to host it, and to listen to everyone who has said something, that's a lot of pressure and responsibility.
Oh yeah, but if you talk about a high-level political negotiating or high political mediated processes, then the mediator or the chairperson, they have a huge amount of people in a support staff assisting them. And secondly, if you talk about a very complex conflict resolution negotiating, there is often a huge, like what happened, for example, and I think is a good example, if you look to how in South Africa they negotiated by themselves actually, with 32 parties after 1990 when Nelson Mandela was released. They have set up a CODESA framework which was subdivided with a lot of expert meetings, and then they can talk differently about legal sector reform or what to do with the security, what are we going to do with the constitution. So under the delegation leaders, there is also a kind of organizational setup with expert groups and with working groups and a lot of meetings underneath it. So that means that, of course, in the end, the chief negotiator is a kind of, and then often on top of the chief negotiator, you have the boss, so to speak, who is seen as the leader of the movement or the party. But underneath the chief negotiator, there is quite a lot of organized support, also tactical on content and so on. But this is just part. Now we're talking about the formal side. There is, of course, also a lot of informal consultation and what happens behind the scenes, what happens in the corridors, what happens in the houses or the residences of people. And the only thing I'm also going to say is that it depends also. Are you talking formal, high political in an international organization? Are you talking, let's say, two countries in a conflict? Or are you talking on regional and local conflict? It could even be that, like in Nigeria, there's a huge problem between the herders and the farmers. And that goes, of course, very much into the local communities. They are organized through mechanisms, let's say a kind of branch organization. That's not the right term, of course, but they are organized in the end by a team of negotiators who then represent the local community, and that is not that organized as a formal world.
And I do understand that. And I wonder because when I hear negotiator, there's always a power structure attached, as you said. A negotiator goes in because there's something at stake and they want to defend it.
Interest.
Exactly. They want to defend their interest. Yeah. And maybe I'm naive. But having the hope that if we had someone neutral coming in, and that's why I would be curious when you train negotiators or mediators, what role does neutrality actually play?
Of course. Yeah.
And is it something that we can train? Because I think as human beings, especially in political context, can we be really neutral?
If you ask the question also, if people at a personal level can be 100% neutral, they can be neutral in the sense that they could be selected without having an interest like the negotiating parties. Like for example, it could be a mediator from outside the region, or it could be a mediator from outside the conflict. That is possible. A mediator, as I said, must impose neutrality, must have literally a facilitating role. But there is also something, if you talk about what is the interest of a mediator, there is an interest of the mediator, as I said before, like to be seen as a legitimate person who is fit to be seen as a good mediator. So any attack, sometimes parties, if they don't want to make a deal, they could attack the mediator saying you're not neutral anymore. And that could be an accusation or whatever. But if parties all the time question your respect, legitimacy to be a mediator, then it will be extremely hard to mediate. So you could say that on one hand, a mediator must be 100% neutral, but I would formulate it in the sense that, and that can be trained to a certain part. some people will never be a good mediator. As simply as that. And then it's more like a natural skill. But I note in my trainings that you can train on awareness, you can train on principles. For example, there is a lot of advice you have to keep in mind, in the sense that how do you share information? Not too much, not too less. Do you communicate with all parties equally? Have you respected also the way you set up the negotiating table? If you position the most important factor in the corner of a table, well, you're out, of course. And therefore you are supported with the whole team. So it can be trained, to be trained on things like awareness, to be seen as a neutral person. And again, if you show off any suggestion that you favor the interest of one party more of the other, for sure you will be on the attack. If you're lucky, you can make the mistake only once and you can be seated. But if you do that for the second or third time, then parties don't find you credible anymore. And the big problem is also that you could be the best facilitator or mediator in the world. Like even the very prestigious figure of Kofi Annan tried to mediate in the Syria conflict in 2012. He made, even in hindsight, a UN plan already in that time to solve or to have at least containment of the conflict. And still, because the parties were not able to find a common ground, he had to stop with his assignment as a mediator, So that doesn't, in this case, it said not anything, because Kofi Annan is probably in the top league of potential mediators, or was actually. And still then, this explains how difficult it is to be a good mediator, And so it can also be because of the political context that you cannot fulfill your role as a mediator. But the bottom line should mean that you must understand a mediator is not a negotiator. You must have some natural gifted talents, but to quite a large extent, it is trainable to fulfill your role.
So what are the key skills or personality sets of a successful, skilled mediator?
Yeah. I think a form of what I would say, in the positive interpretation of charisma, in the sense that, first of all, you must create trust. But you must create trust among parties who have conflicting interests with each other. And it depends on the conflicting interest, how sensitive it is, how emotional it is. The more there is like a shadow of the past of violence and conflict, the more difficult it will be as a mediator to be seen all the time as neutral and to be seen as a trustworthy third party. But that is number one. If you cannot create trust and that they see you as a legitimate and respected mediator, you're out. So the thing is, on one, you must not make yourself too jovial, too personal, actually. And on the other hand, you must not also be seen that you are too much at a distance. So you must create a connection, but still that they see you as a professional and not as your friend. I mean, friend in the sense of too friendly. So trustworthy, a kind of, appeal to the people. And then, of course, you must be seen that you understand your business in the way you manage a process, in the way how you organize the procedure. Often parties already before they go to the negotiating table, they have agreed on a format. So if you cannot apply what they agreed on, for example, how many people in a delegation or when to speak or whatever, then you lose credibility. And there is nothing more worse than losing credibility as a mediator. That neutrality element, of course, is super vital. And even within the way you impose neutrality, you can train. You can train with case studies, you can do simulation gaming. And of course, there are very experienced mediators. Often it's not like the mediating. There is a lot of mediation, of course, going on outside diplomacy or outside conflict negotiating. But in my world, basically, it is more often, let's say, literally a third party who is respected because of the performance of this person in the past and still up until today.
Yeah. And I get very curious and I might say something very naive and I will still do it. So in my world of facilitators, it's always about creating psychological safety. It's about meeting or helping individuals to meet as humans. So it's all about flattening the room, deleting all the hierarchies, and helping individuals to put off their mask. And when I listen to you, it is the other extreme of, okay, we have very strict procedures, who speaks when for how long. It's as if men behind masks are actually sitting around a table, and the goal is to preserve that. Is there a specific reason for that? Why to not allow to explore the shared humanity?
But let's see the bigger picture.
Yes, please.
Because we now talk about a certain part of, let's say, facilitation, mediation, negotiating in the diplomatic world. There is, of course, also a lot of engagement between a diplomat and civil society, or between, if you look to, for example, humanitarian negotiating, a humanitarian organization is per definition a non-governmental organization. So of course you have, let's say, in different setups and formats, it can easily be that if you talk about, for example, starting up a process to, now what we have seen on the issue of global health, that one of the big issues was, will the big health companies and governments give up, let's say, the intellectual property rights for a while, that the vaccine can also be produced in other countries, and in particular then in Asian or African countries. Of course, then a whole game starts that you first call your friend, or you first have a cup of coffee in a cafe, and you try to smoothen out where is the big problem or whatever. And then maybe you have, I myself as well, I'm doing a lot of training in Africa on African women mediators. And this training is in particular focused on, can we have more women in peace negotiating teams or in mediation in Africa? But those ladies, they come from, maybe 90% is non-governmental. So that means basically that there is a big difference if you are in a formal, procedural agreed setting, or if you are in an informal setting, and in particular on the local level, it's not that organized, And you're right, maybe that humanity, I think we must be clear on that, because I always try to train the diplomats and to train conflict groups in formal settings, that we can be the biggest fighters in the room on the table, but if you leave the room, you can still ask, let's have a cup of coffee. How's your family doing? Have you seen it in the news? Good negotiators can do that. Good mediators can also do that. Their only problem is that they must be extremely careful what they're saying, even informally. But of course, it could even be that you have to realize that the one you work with, let's take the step back again to for example, the EU or the United Nations. It could mean that you meet with a colleague of another country 3 times per week for 4 years. Of course, you build up a relationship, but every professional negotiator knows that once I'm sitting in the room, I'm sitting there as an official defending the interest of my country. But that doesn't mean that you have to be a robot and that you have to be outside the negotiating table. Still, that person with what you said is the mask. So it means you have formal, you have informal. The only thing is that you have to realize that even in an informal setting, and you think, okay, I like this colleague, or it's a friendly person, you always have to realize that what you also say informally can be used against you. So a mediator, having a dinner or having a coffee with the parties mediating, well, that will happen, let's say, only in a very limited way. But be careful. Be careful what you're saying, because they test you. But still, you can talk about what we would call human things instead of talking about a certain paragraph in a kind of agreement.
So basically, it is so structured and so formal and non-human around the negotiation table to protect everyone not to say something that they might regret? Or
yeah, but I wouldn't say unhuman, because I know there are negotiatings which are very aggressive, and because of but that doesn't count for all of it, Luckily, the majority of negotiating is that parties realize we need each other. It's a difference if you are in a kind of win-lose situation, or if you are in a win-win situation. If parties realize we need each other to do concessions to each other, that the end result is better than when we started with. And that's a kind of collaborative behavior in which, of course, you have more space to be open to each other. But that is something you build up. And again, if you are, let's say, in a negotiating process, it can go on for months. Of course, you have the corridors, the coffee drinking, and you could easily talk about also soccer, or, but you must realize that you can do that, you must be aware that what you give away informally can also be given away formally. So you have to be careful with that, but that doesn't exclude to behave like a human normal way. We are all human beings. And that's why I also hated that you can say you almost have to act without emotions, or no, of course you have emotions. So the only thing is just be sure that when you show emotion, that you still can have a kind of rationality about it. Because if you really get emotional without any boundaries, you tend to make the most horrible mistakes. But it doesn't say that you have to be without emotions or to act as a robot, And so to summarize, you have to be very careful in the formalized, with the more informal part, and also that, as well, informal or formal, there are moments that people interact, especially often there the breakthroughs are made.
Exactly, because when we find...
And that happens.
Yeah.
That happens. There are so much good stories. I mean, again, to this example of South Africa, there was on the national side, the chief negotiator was Rolf Meyer, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now the president of South Africa, was the assisting Nelson Mandela. They could get quite along with each other. But they knew their role. But here you can see as well that it can be an important element, to find each other, but with respect, that you still have to defend the interest of another party. But that doesn't mean that in human terms, we isolate each other from each other. So that is that complexity of which mediators, facilitate and negotiate have to be aware of.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. And you made me curious when you mentioned the training of female negotiators in the African context. Yeah. And how do you perceive the power dynamics related also to gender, also to ethnicities, or how do you prepare, how do you handle that? Because it's easy to say, okay, we need gender equality and we need more female negotiators or mediators. Yeah. But how does it look like in reality, and how do you prepare for that?
Well, it's not a gender training. And that's the difference. I'm not an expert on gender, to be honest. I'm an expert on negotiating and mediation and facilitating, whatever. So the only reason, and we have different networks, I have been training. The one I'm the most involved with is a project with the South African Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we have set up since 2013 a training for African women mediators who are potentially fit to become mediators in the future. They come from all over Africa and they fly to Pretoria. And I'm part of a longer training, and I train them. What should you know as a mediator about negotiating skills? And the only reason why it is an exclusively women group is because the numbers are lacking. The negotiating in peace negotiating team is predominantly done by men. And it's changing a little bit. It's changing step by step. So what we realize is that there must be more women with a certificate. There must be more women who get opportunity to be invited for observation on behalf of the African Union, for example. So women need to get a face as a mediator. And more importantly, that there would be a system that the ones you have been training can be put in a database of the African Union or SADC or other regional organizations, that once the parties are looking for a mediator, that they also can go, for example, to the FemWise initiative or to the initiative Women's Networks of ECOWAS or the Arab League, or so many things are going on, that they look there for professional women to be mediators. So the thing is that I train women precisely the same as mixed groups,
Do you think that they have different skills or different ways to approach mediation?
This is a difficult discussion for me, because I must honestly say that I don't know, in the sense that I don't perceive it from the perspective as if women negotiators are professionally different than men negotiators. And
which is a good thing if you don't see the difference.
No, and again, I'm not specifically, there are experts saying they do, but okay. But the thing is that a professional negotiator, women or men, must be professional, Yeah. And the only thing I wanted to say is the following. I also have, of course, that we speak about, especially when you talk about peace building or post-conflict reconciliation. Of course, I'm not stupid. I see that mothers and women and children have a different perspective if you were in a very violent conflict, and how to make sure that you bring peace in a civil society. Of course. And that's why I strongly believe there should be more women in peace building and also during the peace negotiating. Because if you talk about, for example, on reconciliation in the society, if you talk about good policies to protect women for future violence, of course, then it is logical. I also realize that, and I'm doing a kind of debating exercise always with them, without a tool or without any exercise. I have always a discussion. It is often for mothers or women much more difficult to leave their country or community and to sit for half a year in Arusha or in Addis Ababa to be a part of a negotiating team, and you have to leave your family for half a year behind, and especially with young children. And there is another way of running the society, of course, than we have here in the West. That kind of stuff we talk about, But that is the context. And of course, I super realize that, and I take very good note of that. But when I'm training, for example, on how to deal with a deadlock or how to deal with a stalemate or how to organize your negotiating team, then I'm just doing the same training.
Yeah. And how do you prepare? Because I can imagine that in a situation where you have two strong leaders, maybe in a post-conflict or still in the conflict situation. Yeah. And then you mentioned that the mediator is very important, that they're respected from the beginning, taken seriously, and that they can spark this kind of atmosphere. Yeah. Is it because there also you have to respect the cultural context? Absolutely. So can you place a woman in between two warlords who don't respect women?
Yeah, that's a tricky question in the sense that you said it rightfully. You mentioned the word respect. There are situations possible, and I've seen it in particular at a local level, where a women's group or a woman being a leader of an NGO is so much respected by all parties that a woman could do that. Mm-hmm. But I have also seen more patriarchal situations that I know for sure that it will not be acceptable for the big men leaders, So it depends. It depends on the situation. But you're right. It is far more difficult if there is a women unfriendly mentality or atmosphere, and then it will not work. Yeah.
Can you prepare women to such a situation? How would you address it?
To be honest, if I work, I have been training so many women groups now, and I've done it in so many different configurations. I've done training for the Arab Women's Network, for the African Union one, for national ones, for ASEAN, for Southeast Asia. Those women are so strong. come on, who am I? Really, really. And I have so much respect for them because they stand for a cause. I'm also talking about women leaders, who stand for also a civil society group or human rights group or just a societal group, and not only the ones who are officially employed by a government. Yeah, maybe it's because I'm 9 out of 10 cases, almost okay, I'm not even involved in the selection process. They just ask me to do the training, and then I will get a participants list. But like this project I'm doing with South Africa, they come from all over Africa, and you see them, from all different backgrounds. It could be very conservative Muslim women up until a very respected local community women leader, or it could be an ambassador, a women ambassador, and that is the fun about it, that they come from so many different backgrounds, but what they share is actually, again, how strong they are and how much personality they already bring, because you need to have that to become a good mediator.
The charisma you mentioned before. Yeah.
Exactly.
Hello, listener. Are you tired of listening to my podcast voice praising our sponsor Session Lab in each episode? I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. So if you are as much of a Session Lab fan and user as I am, please share your experience and praise, and don't be shy of add a sentence of self-promo. Send me your soundbite and you might hear yourself on the next show and find your name and URL in the show notes. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.